Hi everyone. So welcome to your first post-lunch session. Hope you're okay. Unpacking headless. We'll talk from the front lines of digital experience. That's our topic for the next 50 minutes or so. This is me with a bigger than life picture. My name is Maya. I'm a Drupal developer at Evolving Web, and to be honest, I don't have much experience with headless projects, so I'm glad to be here with you guys. And maybe you noticed from my accent, but I'm a French citizen. And when Maya first asked me to talk about headless, I was like, headless? For me, it first resonates with the French Revolution, because at that time, as a people, we kind of industrialized the headless business. But I'm glad to be with you guys to learn more about headless. Speaking of you, could you introduce yourself? Maybe Nika, if you want to go first.
Sure, of course. I'm Nika. I work at Contentful right now as partner success. Prior to Contentful, I was on the client side managing Contentful, telecommunication company in Canada for Canadians and TELUS. And before that, Scotiabank with Adobe, and prior to this, Drupal. And I also worked at EPAM when I was in Ukraine. Happy to be here.
Oh, I'm next. Hey everyone, John Picozzi, solutions architect at EPAM, avid open source enthusiast, longtime Drupal community member, organized the Drupal camp in New England, and I am a podcaster. Built Drupal solutions for organizations like Marriott, Novartis, even the Rhode Island School of Design. So happy to be here.
And hi everybody, my name is Pete Navarra. I've been in the DXP space for about the last 16 years, most notably working with Sitecore. I'm a 6-time Sitecore MVP. And I've been through agencies like Valir, Proficient, Excentia, and Breakpoint. So happy to be here.
Okay, thank you guys. Just before we start, maybe a few questions for the audience, like who knows what headless is here? Or approximately. Okay, and who wants to discover what it is and maybe try to use it in the future? Okay, let's go with our first question. What key factors should an organization evaluate when deciding whether to go headless? Peter, you want to start?
Sure, I'll take this one off. So really, for me, there's a couple different things you want to look at. Number one is your content and whether it needs to span multiple channels. If you have multiple channels you're trying to get your content out to, running a headless environment actually allows you to get that content in a way where you don't have to have repeated content. It can be shared across multiple channels using the APIs because it is a headless environment. Another thing we want to look at is around if there's a desire to really decouple your backend from your front-end development teams, where you want to have that separation. Headless gives you an opportunity to really focus on building a user experience that is in the React and the front-end programming experience. And so you can decouple your backend. Also means you can decouple your platform. And then at the end of the day, it's also about composability. If you have several different platforms that you kind of want to start to bring in, you can compose your own platforms with headless and being able to span across the APIs.
Yeah, I mean, I think to piggyback on the reuse of content piece, right? You may not even realize it right now that you need that. I actually had a client where they put out an RFP. They said, hey, we have to build an omni-channel headless web platform. And then we worked to built it with Drupal. And they were utilizing it, it was working great, and then they were like, why did we build this headlessly? And the response was like, well, you asked us to, so that we did it. But ultimately, it took them a little while to realize the benefits of the headless platform that they had asked for. So I think when you're looking at this from an organization and trying to figure out if it makes sense for you, you want to look at not only the here and now, but also future cases where you could expand the platform and use that content in the future.
I would agree to this. So omni-channel ability to integrate, because headless is API first. So if you would like to integrate with any digital assets management, any analytics platform, you can do this through the API, so it's a big plus. And again, to what Guy said, it's omni-channel. You have content in a single source. You can power to mobile, kiosk, digital signage all over the place. And with the current 2025, you can also feed this to AI. So you have structured content in a single source of truth. You can give the access to your content to OpenAI, ChatGPT, or Claude by Anthropic, and you can use this content to generate dynamic experiences for your mobile, web, wherever you want.
Okay, thank you. I forgot to say that in the beginning, but we're going to have a Q&A session in the end. If you have questions, if it is really on the topic, you can ask right away, but we're going to have a Q&A session in the end. Next question, does adopting a headless architecture mean sacrificing control over the presentation layer?
Yeah, that is like a common misconception.
You go on.
So, no, it doesn't, is the short answer, right? I think that's the biggest, one of the biggest misconceptions is like, hey, if I go headless, or if I enter into a super structured system for editing my content, I'm going to lose control. I'm going to not be able to put things where I want them to. I actually just came off of a project working for a large pharmaceutical where we actually built a whole presentation layer in Drupal that replicated what the headless front end was going to look like. So that way, right within the Drupal CMS, they could place components out of using Layout Builder. They could place components on a page, they could click a button to see a preview, and then publish it and send it out to the headless front end. So no, you do not have to lose control over your presentation layer.
I think in some regards, you actually gain more control. Because the other thing you get though is with that more control, it's like the Spider-Man, more power, greater responsibility. When it comes to that, you do have more control over the rendering pipelines and the ability to really get down to what you're presenting on the front end. But with that comes with a lot of extra governance that you have to make sure in order to have more of a consistent user experience.
Mm-hmm. And to add to this, with the headless, you're not losing presentation layer, you actually can choose what framework I would like to use for my presentation layer. Your developer is now free to choose. Do I choose Next.js? Do I choose React? What frontend? So it's completely decoupled. So you still have control over the presentation layer, you're just doing this differently. And also, again, I'm from Contentful, speaking on behalf of Contentful. Contentful, for example, similar like Drupal, the sidecore, they also have a layer. If you really, really want this drag and drop with the row and column and all those components, there are tools like Contentful Studio available to do this on top. So I assume in Drupal and sidecore, similar functionality.
Yeah, another misconception on this actually too is, and I've heard this in some of the clients that I've had, is they're so used to more of the monolithic platforms like Sitecore as an example, where one of their key benefits that Sitecore had was their page editor. It was like I could see what my site looked like verbatim when I knew it was going to publish when I hit the publish. And to a lot of marketers, they don't want to lose that kind of control of what you see is what you get before you publish. And so there's a misconception out there is where like by going headless, maybe I'm not going to be able to see such a final markup. And I think that's where a lot of companies like Contentful actually is making a lot of headway. On the Sitecore side, they have XM Cloud where they have their page editor, and that's really where you can start to see the WYSIWYG. But what you're looking at is these products are having to kind of rebuild that WYSIWYG experience in a headless manner. So I think that's one of the biggest misconceptions from that aspect of it.
Okay, that's good news. That's a no from the three of you.
Yeah.
Okay.
Can I just want to ask about the example you gave when you said that you actually built like a front end in Drupal, even though it wasn't the real front end in the headless model. Did you have some kind of like shared code base so that you didn't have to completely redo all your code?
So let me clarify. The preview functionality was actually using the headless front end.
Okay.
So basically, what was happening was they would hit the preview tab, and it would open a new tab with the headless an instance of the headless front end that was taking that data and just presenting it.
Just like spin up that one page, just like take a look at it.
They could actually peruse the site. Yeah. So it was like a live demo or a live preview of the site. But it was just taking that, basically it was taking the, not to get overly technical, but it was taking the revision and it was showing it in the site as if it were a live page.
Okay, but it was like a some test environment or something.
Yeah, it was its own Node, Next.js, Node.js environment.
Thanks.
Sure.
No worries. Now, how do you ensure collaboration between marketers and developers in a headless environment? Peter?
Yeah, I think one of the things that we're seeing is really, for the marketers, especially in like product companies, you're focused on making your product better. At the end of the day, the website is the product for that marketer, and it's really kind of adopting more of a product mindset and kind of a shared design language around how you're going to show your website, and then having that with the developers that are actually building the front end side and being able to have that shared knowledge language to really establish more of a shared design system.
Yeah, it's funny, the folks at Pantheon asked me this question via Slack the other day for something that they were doing, and they were like, "Oh, can we quote you?" And I'm like, "Yeah, sure." But the gist of my answer was like, a component-based design system is like a common language, right? So like from an organizational point of view, if you have a design system, that's awesome, and that can act as a common language between your marketing team and your development team, because everybody understands like, okay, when we're talking about the hero component, here's how it's going to look, here are the elements that go into it, and then the development team can say, okay, here's how we translate this into our CMS of choice, right? And then the marketers can say, well, we need the image to be a little bit bigger, or a little bit smaller, we need it to do this or do that, and it evens the playing field for everybody. Everybody understands, has that common language that they're speaking all around that design system. So I'm a big fan of component-based design systems.
And from contentful perspective, what we like to do, we'd like to educate people first. We get in developers, content practitioners in the room and explain what is structured content in the first place and who is doing what. Because developers tend to think from the database-like perspective. Hey, I have this field, I have this boolean, I have this, but then content marketers will be using this. So the key is getting them into the room together and talk about this. Hey, we're building this promotion that will be displaying on the website. What is the structure of this promotion? Do you have the fields? Do you have the image? Do you have CTA assets? So my point of view, let's get them into the room. Let's make sure that it's all non-technical, people-friendly, but developers will have no problem executing because it's all API-driven systems.
And the real key to the success around that really is the relationship between marketing and development and being able to work collaboratively with each other. I think that's where those preview environments that you were talking about become so important, is because making sure that you have those preview environments that I can look at it and say, this is what it's going to look like, but it doesn't look right. I can go to my developer and show them that, and then work together to like update that.
Yeah, I'll also say shameless self-promotion, like solution architects are super important in that process as well. Just saying.
And I think this is true also in a non-headless environment, like having a design system to have developers and marketers talking the same language is possible in a regular Drupal website. You can do that.
Yeah, a coupled solution would have the same, it's the same kind of common language, definitely, absolutely.
All right. Any questions about that? Let's go on. What factors should teams consider that might lead them to avoid choosing a headless solution? Nika?
Do you need this project for just a website and it's a simple website? Yes, then why go headless? Headless shines when you need to reuse your content for multiple channels again. Website, mobile, digital kiosk, digital signage, AI. If you're just building a simple website, headless might be an overhead. Out of the box, like a classic platform provides some WYSIWYG, what you see and what you get, that people can use without any development. For headless, you need to have front-end developer. If you don't have front-end developer, why would you build this whole thing from scratch?
Yeah, I think that's an important point there is, whenever we consult with a client and they're like, hey, we want to go headless and we know we're going to be handing the project off to an internal team, we like, well, do you have the talent to support a React application or a Next.js, Node.js environment, or whatever your headless infrastructure is? And a lot of times it'll be like, oh, well, we have one guy and he kind of knows it and we can retrain people. And it's like, yeah, okay, that is a possibility. Absolutely, you could hire, right? But it doesn't make a lot of sense in some cases to say, especially in the case where it's like, oh, we just have a brochure site. We don't need to share the information anywhere. Like, you want to look at the big picture, the whole picture, and say, oh, well, we have a team of Drupal developers or these types of developers. Like, maybe it doesn't make sense to bring in this other technology because there's going to be overhead there of staffing and retraining.
Yeah, they said everything I was going to say. So with regards to like the idea around the front-end developers, that's also where partners can play a big play. So even if you don't have a lot of front-end developers, but you do have some of those more complex integrations that you need where headless doesn't make sense, then you can start to bring in the partners and be able to say, hey, I'm going to align with an EPAM and say, you can help us with that journey. So it's just because you don't have the front-end tech doesn't necessarily mean you can't be successful with it, but it does mean you need to be understanding where those resources come from as well.
I will totally hit that softball. We love doing staff augmentation. So, if you don't have a team in-house or you want to train your team, we'd be happy to come in and help do that.
I'll take the commission on that.
And I'm just gonna say the same thing. Like, if we want to, like, we do staff augmentation as well. If you need someone, we can talk after that. Do you have questions? We have other questions that we prepare after that, but for now, do you have things that you want to ask those three incredible people? Yes.
In terms of maintenance, so after the website has already launched, what do you see taking more time, like back-end maintenance or front-end?
So, they're depending on how your platform's architected, right? Like, typically back-end maintenance is probably more intensive, right? But you also have to ensure any back-end changes to your APIs don't affect your front end. So I don't want to say that they're equal. I would say I would probably weight the back-end updates and maintenance as a little bit more hefty than the front end. But you have to consider both sides with every set of updates and maintenance. Definitely.
Well, I think that's where SaaS really comes into play too, is because when you talk about maintenance, you're talking about like uptime and from the backend perspective. If I'm running a SaaS platform, I probably already have high availability figured out. So if I have to do maintenance, I can take one node out. No, my customers don't know that I'm doing maintenance, basically. So with regards to like the back-end server maintenance, it depends on how you have the architecture set up. If you're using a SaaS platform like Contentful or one of the other platforms out there, they probably are doing maintenance in the background, and you probably don't even know it. With regards to like the other types of maintenance, it depends on how frequently your marketing team is wanting to make changes to the website. If you've got a really good solid design pattern that is reusable, then typically you can just use some of the same components and change it, and that maintenance is really light. It just kind of depends.
Okay. Are you talking more about like module
Well, that's what I was going to clarify. Like, say if you have like 5 modules that you just updated, security patches or updates, does that screw up the front end at all ever?
So I'm smiling because my technical lead often, like when we would be building a feature, I'd be like, oh, there's a Drupal module for that, and we'll just apply the Drupal module, and then he would go, yeah, but we're working in headless, so, and I go, right, API updates, and that has to be available to the API for the front end. So obviously with like decoupled, headless, you have to think about those updates and how they're going to impact and what's actually changed, and make sure you're doing your due diligence and testing. But I would say that there are probably some modules you can just update that aren't going to impact the front end because they're more back-end focused modules, right? But anytime you make a change that updates the API, you want to make sure that you're factoring that in.
Okay.
In Contentful reality, you don't maintain backends, so your application built in your front end, so you only need to worry about your front end. Contentful obviously will maintain the whole platform. You just need to call Contentful API, which in 10 years hasn't been changed to be backward incompatible, so you don't need to worry about this at all. But if your front-end application have an integration with some systems like e-commerce, Shopify, of course you're gonna maintain the backend of your application. You can also use Contentful to fetch the content, but that will be on you.
Okay.
Yeah, and this might actually be, broadly known, but one of the key advantages of using headless is the fact that you can actually incorporate not only APIs from third-party platforms, but your own APIs for certain business logic. And so one of the key factors of ensuring that you have healthy maintenance is ensuring that you've got a really good versioning on your API, and that your pattern, your mechanism, and your strategy for how you version your APIs does allow for backward compatibility. That will help keep the site working when cross changes.
I have a question.
So, yeah, I had a more, well, I'll give you the business context, and then I want to know from a kind of Drupal or Sitecore experience. So, build a higher education website, big university website. So, structured content certainly already happens. We're building different content types that have faculty profile. I want this information kind of thing. Reuse that with views, have modular component-driven design. Why would I need headless in that realm? Or why would I not just use Drupal views and content types with the structured data?
Well, I mean, I think it goes back to content reusability, right? So like if you're just using it for the web, great. If you are like, hey, we have a mobile app, hey, we have reader boards within the school, like that's really where it flourishes. That being said,
you could use feeds, right?
There's no reason you can't enable APIs on your coupled Drupal site to support those other things, right? It's more of thinking of it as a model of like, okay, if I'm going to build this content once and I want to use it everywhere, how do I build it to be able to do that?
And it seems like then putting a more flexible composer layer on the front end. Like if I wanted to throw up lots of like an event site very quickly and pull faculty profile and pull a news item and pull this and have a quick design, it seems like a headless situation would be more helpful because I'm not building it. I don't need the Drupal resources to make that happen. Is that the choice I'm making from a business perspective there? Yeah,
I mean, I think so. I think there's also a little bit of a long tail approach here too, where you have a headless backend and you want to refresh your front end. You don't have to rebuild everything. You can just rebuild the front end, right? So now you're taking that idea of like, oh, I have to do a big bang update every 2 or 3 years and just like throwing it out the window because your backend can be flexible, your APIs can easily be updated, as Pete said, like versioning appropriately, like you can update those APIs to then power any front end, right? It makes that redesign or that front end re-implementation like a much smaller build, a much smaller bill. So like there's a lot of benefit there.
I think I like your question a lot too because I think headless isn't for everybody. It's not for every company, right? And I think a lot of, especially if they're like really just innovative technologists out there who don't really know what they're doing, but they know they want headless. They don't know why they want headless. But I got to get to headless because it's a buzzword. I mean, AI, right? So just because somebody's proposing to go headless doesn't mean it's necessarily right. And it really does come down to like, how are you reusing that content? That's like the number one biggest reason why you would go headless.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, there's a good use case that you could mirror or you could apply to many other industries, like in pharma, right? They have the idea of a healthcare provider website and then just the general like drug website, right? So like you have 2 different websites. They could look completely different on the front end, but in theory all be coming from the same back end content feeds, right? So I mean, like think about that, on a bigger scale where you could multiply that basically.
Is it on the same?
Well, it's just something else to think about with this is. So at Chewy, we ended up using our React design system on a migration of a Drupal website.
Okay.
So we're using the same design system with a different set of design tokens, different typography, color, and everything, but all the same React components are driving that Drupal site we didn't set out to do headless on the Drupal site. It just happened to be a way for us to implement our design language onto an existing content store of thousands of articles. So I mean, like, I just think of that in a university environment where they may have a very strong identity. You may find schools that have built out a design system. Bringing that design system front end to a Drupal back end is pretty powerful. And oftentimes way less than building something in Drupal that looks like what they already have as a design system.
And actually, just to kind of put a cap on that too, you know, in terms of you know, why you might use headless is if you think down the road you might actually change out your platforms, and maybe, you know, the flavor of the day platform is Drupal, maybe next year it's going to be optimizing, maybe. What you can actually do with headless is you can have that singular design system that's built out of React, and then what you're doing is really just changing out the connections to the back end. You don't have to re-architect your site. And that's been the biggest thing with Sitecore, where it seemed like every time there was a Sitecore update, we had to rebuild the website because they just changed so much. Some of the cons of Sitecore, I guess you could say, but like, you know, in that regard, that's why every push for Sitecore site is to go headless, because they're getting away from the need to always having to re-implement their site when there's an update.
Yeah, so we are enterprise website, and we're thinking about headless, and we do not, it's only just website, there's no reusable. We are just using Drupal from the beginning out of the box. So we're thinking about moving to headless, but the issue is like with other person, shorthanded. The second one is like, I feel like we can build performance. SEO is a big thing for us. I mean, headless definitely is a big thing for the benefit for the SEO, but I kind of want to test it. Like, is that, do you guys feel part of the site, like news blogs can be the headless, and part of the site still remain the same, like Drupal way? And do you feel like is there any like bad part of it?
So I mean, there are methods to which you go partially decoupled or partially headless, right? So going back to kind of what Jason was saying is like you can pull in certain React components into your Drupal pages if you want to, or you could serve different pages from the node environment. I mean, basically, based on what you just said, like I don't know that there's necessarily a use case for content reuse there. So I don't know that if it makes a lot of sense to like spend the time and energy going down that road if it's not going to be something where you're going to see content reuse or need the APIs to feed other systems and platforms. That's one thing that on the last project I worked on, we actually saw the APIs existed because it was a headless platform, and other business units started using the APIs to pull that data out and use it within their applications, right? So it's not just different uses of the content as far as presentation uses, right? It could be in other platforms within the organization. But if you don't have any of that within your organization, I think from a speed and SEO standpoint, you can make Drupal just as fast and just as SEO friendly as a headless front end. Even to the point where you could, if you wanted to, statically cache Drupal pages for long periods of time to make them even faster.
I think you actually hit something there with SEO and some of the analytics, is that when you're using more of the monolithic approach, where you're using the back-end Drupal or back-end Sitecore, it's easier to do SEO and easier to have those analytics because they're baked in the back end on the server side. But when you're running headless, you have to be more intentional about how you implement analytics, how you implement SEO, because depending on how you architect the headless experience, you can actually kill your SEO. Especially if you have a developer that wants to do a lot of client-side rendering. Search engines, they're not going to see any of your website if it's a client-side rendering. So that's when you start thinking about static site generation, server-side rendering, that kind of thing. It really kind of depends on how you architect the headless, which means you have to be more purposeful about it, more mindful.
Yeah, that's one of the reasons we picked static site generation and all the sites were statically generated on the server before they were presented to somebody. It made them faster and it made them more friendly to SEO.
Any other questions? Yeah.
Do you want to say anything about security implications of headless?
Good question. Security.
I hear all the CISOs like, yes, you do. So I mean, security, like don't do dumb stuff. I don't know, like I mean there are security. I don't know if there are any more or less security implications to a headless infrastructure than there are to a coupled infrastructure, right? There is more to secure for sure because there are connections from your front end to your back end, so on and so forth. But ultimately, I think like you're going to probably look at your security, and full disclosure, I am no security expert. Like you're going to look at your security holistically, right? To say like, okay, our front end server is only going to accept information from our back end server and vice versa. Login happens from our organizational IP address. There are a lot of things you're going to look at from your whole architecture to say, oh, here are the security areas where security is necessary for us to think about.
I think in some regards, headless implementation might actually be more secure in some regards, because especially if you're doing like static site generation, that's just reading from like an S3 bucket in Amazon at the end of the day, could be. Or you're using some kind of CDN. It's really abstracted from the back-end systems, where security really becomes mindful, and that kind of architecture is more around how you implement your APIs. Don't put your read-write token in plain readable that somebody can sniff out, right? Like that may be where you have a back-end system that just serves up what my token should be for accessing this API, and that's like one of the few back-end services that I have that the site's using, as an example. But I would say really how do you have a healthy API thought around how you implement it is really the key around security and headless.
And I mean, not to fanboy out over Drupal, but Drupal does a pretty good job of locking down the APIs to be like, hey, if you don't have access to this in Drupal, you don't have access to it via API, so don't try. Right?
I've heard it touted that headless is better for security, kind of because of what you're describing, where like, well, if people are interacting with only the front end chunk of what you built, then that back end is safe in some way. You just don't even know how to get to it.
There's just layers of abstraction, and then at that point you can actually build in more security, like web application firewalls. Now you have API gateways, API firewalls that are really monitoring what's accessing that API. So it just gives you extra opportunities for more layers, in my opinion.
You can also cache your API. So like our APIs were cached via Cloudflare. So like everybody was going to Cloudflare, whether it was like, it was a front-end request, an API request, even like the front end was using the APIs out of Cloudflare. So it was like, everybody had to go through that web application firewall before they could ever get to any data. So
also in your headless CMS, you usually keep in your marketing content, like content that will be accessible on your front end. So it's like, I don't see how you would screw up security there. I only saw once, like people were using on their front end, they were using content management API from their front end application, so people could access the website, find the content management application, and go and do stuff in your CMS. But it's very hard use case that people would do that.
Just want to echo the security part, and also what Peter was saying. We just did our first headless implementation for Sitecore, and there are tools out there that really helps with the headless part. Like we use a thing called Vercel, which is very helpful to our developers, and as a part of a security feature, especially if you're getting a lot of bots and DDoS attack and things like that. Tremendous help, and it's very fast in terms of the data transfers and things like that.
Yeah.
What about like the content authoring experience? And does that still sit on the back end where, for example, you're using things like WYSIWYG editors, that's kind of simple, that you rely on the back end, but there was a talk about experience builder, where it's like, similar to something like Wix. Would that be developed on, not the front end, right? That would still be on the back end?
Yeah, it's all going to be contained, at least for Drupal, it's going to be all contained within the Drupal CMS. So that's all on the back end and then gets fed out through APIs. The platform that I've worked on is built-in layout builder, which is like, the Experience Builder light, if you will. When Experience Builder comes out, it's my understanding that a lot of the block structures that we're already using would be able to be used within Experience Builder as I believe they're calling them custom components. So you'd be able to bring those in and drop them into a page just like you would be any other Experience Builder component. And then from that all gets fed through the API out to the front end for, display.
So layout builder, does that provide an API as well about how many columns you have and where content sits, or how does that work?
So we actually built a normalizer for that. So that way that content was normalized and better understood by the front end, but it all can be fed out through the API into the front end.
Okay.
Yeah.
Just a quick thought, you had mentioned sort of how to try it in your project, Paychecks, right?
Yeah.
So I would just offer the thought that finding an island, a small project, a series of microsites, whatever it is, but find a champion internally that you can kind of partner with, and build a small but meaningful test. So maybe it's event microsites, or maybe it's something scoped that you can kind of own and control without reaching too far. Because it's not an either or, you can do both, right? I think that the theme that's come out in this conversation is headless when it makes sense, and classic Drupal whenever, and other systems maybe as well. So I think if you can find whether it's the executive sponsor, yourself, whoever it is, right? Find a friend and try that project, make a case for the project, and then use that to build energy and positive vibes about the idea internally. I think that's how Contentful got a lot of your start, is you were not winning the whole project, you were winning an island, and then that island got bigger and bigger, right? So I think that's the sort of a strategy I've seen work. The other thing I would just offer is, to come down with, we have a tool that is AI-based that brings you from whatever you are on to Next.js. So it's pretty cool, and there's you can get a trial of it and stuff. So there are ways to sort of expedite from where you are legacy to where you want to try on other things. So it could be kind of fun.
I also want to call out, I know you were kind of more focused on the Drupal side, but I think it's a great question because it really depends on, having that authoring experience and that authoring environment. It's going to really be dependent upon the platforms that you're using as well. So like John said with the Drupal, you can build in that Drupal backend. On the Sitecore side, they're really looking at this as being able to publish your front-end code through a process that then will show up through their SaaS product of XM Cloud, so you can see it in their, I'm using air quotes, but WYSIWYG editor, to see what the site's going to look like as you're editing. And that's what you're going to continue to see on a lot of platforms. I think we were talking at lunch.
Yeah.
Let's
For us, it's a new product called Contentful Studio that's essentially a layout builder that will give you with Contentful. You will just register your design system components in there, just almost like line of code registering, and then you will do all those columns drag and drop, but still connecting those components to the structured content in a headless system. So you have good things from both worlds: structured content, structured design, separated, and then your front-end application is rendering this.
Yeah. And then on the platform side for Sitecore, if you're not using their SaaS product, they have a layout service API that also allows you to kind of have more control over that rendering pipeline.
Okay, we have time for one more question. If not, I have a small one. I have a problem with the term headless. Like decoupled, I get it. Headless, to me, the head is where the logic happens, where the content is stored. So why, do you know why we say headless?
Because Because it's your face.
Yeah.
Really?
That's what you're going with?
It's the face of the application. So
Skinless then. Yeah, faceless.
Faceless just sounded, it sounded sketchy, so.
It really stems from a lot of, like, when we think about the monolithic platforms, and I'm going to use Sitecore as the example because that's what I'm closest to, they have this idea around server architecture. So your content authoring is happening on the content management server, and your content delivery is happening on the content delivery server. And if you need to scale out, you need to have 2, 4, 6, however many content delivery servers that you need to have in order to scale for your website. That's the head of your website. So those servers, that's what you're having to deal and expand and scale on a platform side. So when we think about headless, it's getting rid of those front servers and then kind of putting it on more of a global scale. So Vercel, I should have mentioned earlier, but like Vercel is one of those companies that has seen this as kind of the forerunner of saying, hey, we want to be able to provide edge servers to everybody, so we're going to create a system that people can do that and run their headless applications. You have Netlify, which is another great application that does that. But you can also, like I said earlier, you can also run headless as an S3 bucket if you really want to get to it. So it's really the removal of those content servers at the front.
But I'm also going to ask Sasha and Paolo, those creators of Contentful, and Contentful was early creator of Headless. Why did they call it Headless? So good point, guys. I'll ask and let you know.
I just want to pass along that Margot Bloomstein really wanted somebody to make like a headless horseman joke about like Ichabod Crane. We get something going with that.
There was a reference to that in the original title.
My submission for this channel is the headless horseman.
Consider it official that like we're disappointed.
See, I got vetoed.
John.
I'm fine with your disappointment.
I think, to be cheeky as well, though, I think, the term headless, at the end of the day, the heart of your website is actually the content, not the head. So.
I mean, they could have called it a multi-headed architecture, but that seems like a lot to say.
They tried to call it serverless architecture, but that didn't catch on.
All right, no more questions? Oops. Thank you, you three, for your participation. Thank you, everyone, for your questions. Have a good afternoon.